The trail had been empty for hours when I saw it. Through the trees, halfway up the slope, a small cabin stood crooked against the dark. Its roof sagged, boards warped, porch caved in on one side. It looked like no one had set foot near it in decades. But in the upstairs window, a lantern glowed faintly. I froze mid-step, boots sinking into the damp earth. The forest was heavy with silence, and that single square of light burned against it like an eye. It shouldn't have been there. There were no houses marked anywhere near this trail, no roads leading in. I told myself it had to be leftover gear, maybe a trick of moonlight on glass. But the longer I stared, the more the light seemed to sway, soft and deliberate, as if someone inside had just passed by. And in that moment, a thought pressed cold against the back of my neck. The cabin wasn't abandoned. It was late autumn, one of those weekends where the air feels sharper than you expect, where the light fades too quickly behind the trees. I had set out on the trail alone, just a single overnight, to clear my head before the first real snow. I wasn't far from the Ranger Road, maybe 5 miles in, but the forest was thick here, the kind that swallows sound and bends the trail until you start second-guessing yourself. My pack was light: tent, bag, a little food, and the small gas stove I always carried. Nothing unusual. I'd left the trailhead just after noon, watching my breath puff white in the cool air, telling myself I'd make camp before dark. But the hike stretched longer than I thought. By the time the shadows grew long, I still hadn't found a good place to pitch my tent. That's when I spotted the cabin through the trees. At first, I thought it was just another ruin. Around here, you sometimes found the bones of old logging shacks. Boards collapsed, chimneys crumbled, nothing left but moss and memories. I expected the same here, but then I saw that lantern glow, warm against the glass. For a moment, relief washed over me. Shelter. Maybe even a chance at a dry night's sleep. My shoulders ached from the pack, and the thought of a roof, even a sagging one, felt like a gift. Still, something about it held me back. The trail was empty. My map marked nothing here. And the ranger at check-in hadn't mentioned cabins. I stood there longer than I should have, the weight of my pack digging into my shoulders, staring up at that crooked little house. And finally, against the quiet pull of my better judgment, I stepped off the trail and toward the light. Up close, the cabin looked worse than it had from the trail. The porch sagged under its own weight. Boards bowed and damp. Nails rusted to orange dust. Moss climbed the stone chimney, and the shutters, if they could still be called that, hung loose like broken arms. But the window glowed. I stood at the bottom of the porch steps, staring. The lantern's light flickered faintly against the warped glass, warm and steady. Inside, I thought I saw movement, just a shift, a shadow slipping past. I cleared my throat and called out, voice low, almost embarrassed. "Hello? Anyone there?" The forest swallowed the words. No answer. I climbed the steps, each creak sharp against the silence. My hand brushed the railing, slick with damp rot. At the door, I paused, fingers hovering near the handle. The lantern glow threw long, thin shadows across the cracks, but I couldn't hear a thing inside. I knocked once. Nothing. Finally, I pushed. The door groaned wide, spilling stale air that smelled of dust and mold. The light drew me in, my boots thudding against warped floorboards. The cabin was empty. Old chairs sat overturned. A table leaned crooked in the corner. Dust hung in the air like smoke, disturbed by my breath. No footprints, no fresh marks. But the lantern on the windowsill burned steady. Its glass was clean, its oil fresh, its wick curled bright and alive. I whispered to myself, uneasy, someone was just here. And yet the silence pressed back, patient and unbroken. I moved deeper into the cabin, each step groaning under the weight of my boots. The place felt abandoned. Peeling wallpaper, a rusted stove, spiderwebs thick in the corners. But the lantern sat there on the sill, impossibly out of place, flame steady, as if it had never known dust. I tried to tell myself a hunter had left it, or some backwood squatter had passed through, but the silence argued otherwise. No boots by the door, no food wrappers, no smell of smoke. Nothing but dust that seemed undisturbed for years. I touched the lantern glass. It was warm. The hair along my neck lifted. I set my pack down on the table and immediately regretted it. The table was coated in thick dust, but when I lifted the bag again, I saw a smear, fresh and wide, where it had been. And then faintly I noticed more smears, on the floorboards, on the backs of the chairs, like hands dragging slowly, years ago, or minutes. The upstairs stairs groaned then. Just one step. I froze, staring at the narrow staircase in the far corner. It was cloaked in shadow, banister leaning like a crooked spine. I whispered, barely audible, "Hello?" Silence. Then another step, long, deliberate, pressing weight into old wood. I backed toward the door, heart pounding. The lantern flame flickered suddenly, swaying side to side as though disturbed by someone passing. But no one was there. And in the window pane above the lantern, I caught it, the reflection of a figure moving across the room. The space behind me was empty. The reflection held me in place. In the glass, a shape crossed the room, shoulders hunched, head bowed, walking slow. But when I spun around, the cabin yawned empty, dust settling in the pale beam of my flashlight. My throat went dry. I turned back toward the lantern. The flame burned steady, but the reflection still moved, dragging itself across the warped floorboards behind me. I whispered, uneasy, "No, no, no." The air grew colder. The hairs on my arms lifted. I heard the faintest sound then, like fabric brushing wood, someone shifting their weight, steady, deliberate. And then the reflection stopped. It stood just behind me, close enough that its blurred outline seemed to lean forward, as though peering over my shoulder. My chest seized. I couldn't bring myself to turn. The lantern flickered again, sputtering low, and for an instant the reflection's head tilted sharply, too far, as if its neck had been bent to breaking. The boards beneath my boots creaked, not from me, from something else, pressing down, leaning close, and though the room behind me was empty, the reflection raised its hand, palm open, reaching straight toward the back of my neck. Instinct took over. I lunged for my pack, knocking the chair aside, and bolted for the door. The lantern flared behind me, shadows stretching tall across the walls as if the whole room had risen to chase me. The porch groaned under my boots, nails screeching in protest. I hit the ground running, the cold night air burning my lungs. Branches whipped at my face as I tore through the trees, desperate to put distance between myself and that cabin. Behind me, the lantern's glow still burned in the window, pale and steady, casting my own shadow across the clearing. But I was outside, and the shadow inside the cabin hadn't moved. It still stood there, hand lifted, watching. I didn't stop until the forest swallowed the sight completely. Only then did I realize how loud the woods had grown. The wind rushing through the canopy, the river far off, even my heartbeat thundering in my ears. But beneath it all, I thought I could still hear it, a faint creak of floorboards following. By the time I reached the Ranger Road at dawn, my throat was raw from breathing cold air, my legs trembling with each step. I told myself I'd imagined it, that fear had twisted an empty ruin into something worse. But when I mentioned the cabin to the ranger, he just frowned. There aren't any standing cabins in that section. Haven't been for years. Too dangerous. They all collapsed. I didn't argue. I didn't go back. Still, even now, the memory clings. The lantern's steady glow. The reflection that didn't match my movements. The hand almost touching my neck. And sometimes, when rain lashes the windows of my house at night, I see a faint light flicker in the glass, warm, steady, waiting. It reminds me that the cabin wasn't abandoned. It never was.
The rain had just started when we found the shack. It leaned crooked at the edge of the creek bed, porch sagging, roof half-caved. From the trail, it looked like nothing more than a ruin, ready to collapse into the mud. But the storm was rolling in fast, and we were soaked to the bone. We thought we were lucky to find it, but we weren't. It was supposed to be an easy weekend, just me, Casey, and Will, following a loop that cut along Dry Creek and circled back to the Ranger Road. The forecast called for a chance of showers, nothing more. By late afternoon, the sky had turned the color of slate. The creek bed, dry when we crossed it that morning, now trickled with water, thin streams cutting through pale gravel. The air smelled sharp, heavy, like metal before lightning. When the rain came, it wasn't a drizzle. It fell fast, soaking through jackets in minutes. Our boots squelched, socks cold against our skin. Will cursed under his breath. Casey pulled her hood low, and I kept telling myself it would pass. That's when Will stopped, pointing through the trees. There! The shack tilted against the bank, half hidden by brush. One side of the roof had collapsed. The chimney leaned like a broken tooth, but it was shelter. a roof between us and the storm. We pushed through the wet grass toward it, packs dragging us down. At the time, I told myself we'd stumbled on luck. But even from a distance, something about the place felt wrong. Inside, the air was thick and sour, heavy with rot. The boards sagged under our weight, damp and swollen from years of rain. Broken chairs slumped in corners, and the fireplace was nothing but a black mouth filled with ash. Still, it was dry. We spread our gear out, wrung water from our sleeves, and lit a lantern. Will cracked a joke about pioneer living. Casey laughed a little too loudly, and for a while we pretended it was fine. But the longer we sat, the quieter it seemed. The storm outside roared steady, rain drumming on the roof, but inside, every sound felt magnified. Our whispers carried too far. The creak of the floor under our boots echoed like someone else was moving in the dark. I told myself we were imagining it, just nerves, just the storm. But then I noticed the door. The wood around the frame was carved, lines, symbols, faint words I had to squint to make out. In the lantern glow, they stood out like scars. One phrase, cut deep into the planks, froze my stomach cold. Don't let it inside. We tried to ignore the carvings, tried to laugh it off as some old prank, but the words sat heavy in the room. Don't let it inside.
Around midnight, the knocking started. It was faint at first, a hollow thud against the far wall, steady and slow. Casey stiffened. Will muttered it had to be branches in the wind, but the sound came again, closer. I pressed my hand to the floorboards. That's when I felt it, a vibration, not from the walls, from beneath us, something moving under the shack. The lantern guttered, shadows stretching long across the warped ceiling. Then a scraping began below, nails or claws dragging slow and deliberate against the wood. Casey whispered, "What if it's trying to get in?" Before I could answer, a noise rattled through the cabin, the sharp clank of iron shifting against wood. We spun toward it. In the corner, half hidden under a rotted rug, a trap door shook against its rusted lock. Once, twice, the wood bowed with each impact as if something below was pushing upward. The three of us froze, eyes locked on the trap door. The lantern light trembled, shadows crawling like black water across the walls. The banging grew harder, the old lock straining against each jolt. Dust fell from the ceiling. The floorboards around the hatch flexed as if something heavy pressed against them, testing for weakness. Casey whispered, "It's coming up!" Will grabbed his pack, voice shaking. "We have to go, now!" The lantern sputtered again, dimming low, then flaring bright. And in that sudden burst, I saw it. Shapes pressed against the seams of the trapdoor, long fingers clawing upward, pale and slick as if they'd never known the sun. The lock groaned. One more strike, and it would give. That was all it took for us to run. We grabbed our packs and bolted into the storm. The porch groaned, then split as we stumbled across it,
rain pelting our faces, thunder cracking overhead. Behind us, the shack shuddered with a deafening crash, the trap door blown open. I didn't look back. None of us did. The sound that followed was enough, the scrape of something dragging itself across the floor, claws tearing at the wood as it pulled free. We ran blind through the trees, boots sinking in mud, branches clawing at our arms. Every step felt too slow, every breath too loud. Only when the creek bed widened ahead of us did we stop, huddling together in the downpour, too afraid to speak. At first light, soaked and shivering, we returned with a ranger. There was no shack. The bank was bare, nothing but wet earth and a few rotted boards scattered like driftwood. No porch, no trapdoor, no carvings on the doorframe. Just emptiness. We never spoke about it again, but sometimes, when the rain beats heavy on my roof at night, I think about those words carved into the wood. Don't let it inside. And I wonder what would have happened if we'd stayed.
I was already lost when I found it. The trail had dissolved into thickets and shadow, my map useless, my GPS blinking with no signal. Dusk pressed in through the trees, every step heavier, every sound sharper. That's when I saw the cabin. It leaned against a clearing, crooked but intact. The strangest detail hit me first. It had 2 doors, one in front, one in back, perfectly lined up like a hallway straight through. I hesitated, then stepped onto the porch, boots creaking against the boards. The front door swung open with a sigh, stale air curling out. Inside it was simple, bare table, single chair, dust thick enough to write in. Safe enough for a night, I thought. But when I tried to leave through the back door, I stepped outside into fading daylight, only to find myself walking back in through the front. The day had started simple. A short ridge hike, no more than 10 miles. I'd left my car at the ranger lot just after noon, planning to circle back before dark. I carried light gear, a pack with snacks, water, my map, and a GPS watch that never failed me. But somewhere along the way, the trail markers thinned. One faded blaze, then none at all. The ridge dipped lower than it should have, and the woods grew thick, closing in until I couldn't even see the sky. By the time I admitted I was lost, the light had already started bleeding out of the canopy. My watch flickered once, then froze on 6:17. No signal.
I pressed on, telling myself I'd find a clearing, a landmark, anything. Instead, the trees thinned suddenly, and there it was, the cabin. It didn't belong. The boards were old but sturdy, shutters closed tight, chimney cracked but upright. And those 2 doors, opposite each other, perfectly aligned as if someone had wanted to create a passage straight through. I should have turned back into the woods, even with night falling. But exhaustion pushed me forward. A roof was a roof. And besides, I told myself, cabins don't just appear out of nowhere. The porch sagged under my weight, but the door opened easily, swinging wide on hinges that should have been rusted solid. Inside, the air smelled of dust and dry wood, faintly sweet, like old paper left in the sun. The room was bare, just a table and a single chair.
No stove, no bedding, no shelves. The floorboards were swept clean, too clean, as though someone had prepared the space for me. I set my pack down and crossed to the back door. The wood felt cold under my palm as I pushed it open. A rush of cool air spilled in, carrying the scent of pine. I stepped out and froze. The clearing stretched before me again, the same angle of trees, the same slope of earth. And when I turned, I wasn't outside at all. I was standing in the doorway of the front entrance, lantern light from my pack spilling across the same table and chair.
I backed up quickly, heart pounding. I must have been confused. Maybe I'd turned around without realizing. I tried again. Front door out, back door in. Each time, no matter how careful, I returned to the same spot, the same cabin interior, as if the forest outside only circled back to the house. By the third try, the chair had moved, just slightly angled toward me, its legs scraping against the floor, and I hadn't heard a sound. I stood frozen, staring at that chair. It wasn't much, a simple wooden frame, one leg shorter than the rest, but I knew I hadn't touched it. And yet it was turned, facing the door now, facing me. I backed away until my shoulder hit the wall. My breath came short and sharp, fogging in the cold air that hadn't been there before. I grabbed my pack, muttering to myself that I'd just leave through a window, but the windows were boarded from the outside, slats nailed in crosswise, no gaps for light to slip through. I swallowed hard and tried the doors again, front to back to front, always the same. Each step carried me in circles, and each time I returned, the room shifted. Once, the table angled just enough to block my path. Next time, the chair sat closer to the window. Then, the lantern in my pack, one I hadn't lit, glowed faintly on the table. My watch still read 6:17. I tried the doors again, faster, desperate, until my steps blurred into panic. Each pass through, the furniture changed, rearranging itself like unseen hands were setting the stage. And on the final loop, I froze, because the chair wasn't empty anymore. Someone was sitting there. The figure sat slouched in the chair, its shape just barely human, shoulders hunched, head bowed low, hands resting too still on the table. I couldn't see a face, not in the lantern glow, just the pale outline of something that didn't breathe, didn't shift, didn't blink. I told myself to move, to bolt through the nearest door, but when I blinked, just once, the figure had changed. Its head was raised now, tilted slightly, like it was listening. I stumbled back, breath catching in my throat. I blinked again, and the posture shifted once more. The figure leaned forward, elbows on the table, watching. Every time I closed my eyes, even for a fraction of a second, it drew closer. I squeezed them shut hard, heart pounding, and when I opened them again, it was half risen from the chair, one hand outstretched, its shadow stretching impossibly long across the floor. And then it spoke, my own voice, delayed and low. Sit down. I bolted before the words even faded. My pack hit the floor as I lunged for the nearest window, ramming my shoulder against the boards. They splintered, nails shrieking loose, and I threw myself through the gap. Glass and wood tore at my arms as I hit the ground outside. Cold dirt, wet leaves, the clean air of the forest. I was out of the cabin. I scrambled to my feet, expecting to see the crooked outline behind me. But when I turned, there was only trees. No porch, no doors, no cabin at all. The woods stretched silent in every direction, and for the first time that night, my watch ticked forward. 6:18. I made it back to the Ranger Road just after dawn. Blood crusted on my arm where the glass had cut me. I told no one. What would I even say? That a cabin had trapped me in a loop until I broke through its walls? But I kept the watch. I still have it. The hands tick forward fine now, except every evening when dusk falls, it hesitates, pauses just for a second at 6:17. And some nights, lying awake in bed, I hear it again, the scrape of a chair leg shifting across wooden boards, as if something is still waiting for me to open a door.
The cabin looked abandoned, but the book inside was waiting for me. It sat open on a ranger's desk, pages yellowed, the leather cover cracked with age. The air smelled of dust and pine sap, thick enough to sting my throat. For a long moment, I thought it was just another relic left behind, until I leaned closer and saw the writing. The ink was dark, fresh, curling across the page in neat, deliberate strokes. At the top, a name had been entered, my name, and beside it, today's date. I hadn't touched a pen, I hadn't signed anything, but the entry was there all the same, waiting for me as though the cabin had known I would arrive. It was supposed to be a quiet trip, just me, the trail, and a few days away from everything that had been clawing at me back in the city. Deadlines, phones buzzing, the hum of traffic that never stopped. I wanted silence. The forest I chose wasn't particularly remote, at least not on paper. A section of national land with a few marked trails and some ranger outposts, the kind of place backpackers passed through without thinking much of it. I'd been on similar routes before, faded trail markers, abandoned cabins, occasional guest logs where hikers scrawled their names like signatures in a ledger of survival. I left the trailhead mid-morning. The air was cool, damp from rain the night before, and the woods smelled sharp with wet pine. My pack was light: tent, bag, stove, a couple of freeze-dried meals, and a slim paperback I knew I'd probably never read. The first hours passed easily enough. Boots crunching on gravel, birds threading the air with calls, light dripping between the canopy and narrow beams. I stopped once for lunch, sitting on a fallen log and eating jerky while the silence folded closer around me. But the farther I went, the stranger it felt. Not wrong exactly, just empty. No distant voices from other hikers, no dogs barking, not even the scurry of squirrels in the underbrush. The forest breathed slow and steady, but it was a solitary breath, as though I'd stepped into a place that had forgotten people existed. By late afternoon, I was tired, searching for somewhere to set up camp, when the trail bent and I saw it. A small cabin squatted just off the path, tucked behind a stand of trees. Its roof sagged but hadn't collapsed. Shutters clung crooked to their hinges, and through a grime-coated window, I thought I saw the pale outline of a desk. It didn't feel right,
but exhaustion tugged me forward. A roof meant shelter, even if only long enough to rest, so I stepped off the trail and toward the cabin. Up close, the cabin looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Moss clung to the lower boards, nails bled rust down the siding, and the roof sagged under the weight of years. The window glass was filmed with grime, but I could still make out the desk inside, just as I'd thought. The door stuck when I pulled it, then gave with a groan. A draft rolled out, stale air laced with dust, wood, and something faintly sweet, like paper left to rot.
Inside was emptier than I expected. A ranger's desk, shelves lined with warped maps, a few cobwebs heavy in the corners. The floor was coated in dust so thick my boots left deep tracks. That's when I noticed the book. It sat squarely in the center of the desk, leather cover cracked, spine bent with age. Dust ringed its outline, but the surface itself was clean, as if it had been handled recently. I lifted the cover. The first page was filled with neat signatures, dates stretching back decades. At first, it felt ordinary, just a guest log, hikers marking their passage. But the handwriting snagged me. Every line looked too similar, as though the same hand had written every name across different years, across different entries. I flipped further. More names, more dates, some nearly a century old, and scattered between them notes, short, strange lines that didn't belong in a trail log. The knocking didn't stop last night. I saw the light again in the woods. It waits by the stairs. My fingers trembled as I turned another page. The ink was dark, fresh, the strokes too sharp to be decades old. And that's when I found it. My own name written cleanly at the top, today's date beside it. For a long moment, I just stared, the cabin pressing in around me, the silence deep enough to make my heartbeat sound loud. My name was written in a hand too neat, too deliberate, and the date, today's date, gleamed dark as though the ink had only just dried. I hadn't signed it. I hadn't even touched the pen lying beside the book. A gust of cold air stirred the pages, though every window was shut tight. The book shivered open wider, and my eyes caught the entry just beneath mine. It wasn't finished. He looks at the desk. He lifts his hand. He turns toward the door. My stomach dropped. That was me. My exact movements captured in words I hadn't yet lived. I slammed the cover shut. The noise echoed too loud, lingering in the room as if another slam had followed mine a heartbeat later. I stumbled back, boot heels scraping the floor. The lantern on the desk rattled against the wood. And then, faintly, I heard it. Footsteps, slow, measured, directly above me. I looked up. The ceiling sagged, beams gray with rot. Stairs collapsed long ago. There was no way anyone could be up there. But the steps came again, dragging across the boards, heavy enough to stir dust from the rafters.
I forced my eyes back to the book. Against my will, I opened it again. The page had filled further. He hears it walking. He doesn't move. He doesn't breathe. I hadn't taken a breath since reading. And then, slowly, in fresh strokes curling across the page, he realizes he isn't alone. The pen beside the log shifted, just a fraction, rolling against the desk as if nudged by an unseen hand. I stumbled back, knocking into the shelves, old maps cascading to the floor in a puff of dust. My throat felt raw, but no sound came out. The log was still writing. He steps back. He looks at the stairs. He wants to leave. The ink spread across the page in real time, letters curling smooth and unhurried, as though someone invisible sat across from me, watching. I snapped the book shut again. My fingers pressed hard into the cracked leather, but I could still hear it, the faint scratch of a pen moving just beneath my palm. From above, the footsteps grew heavier, circling, dragging, like someone pacing an empty room. The ceiling groaned, and dust sifted down through the beams. I backed toward the door, eyes locked on the desk. That's when the book slid open on its own. Pages flipped in a blur, stopping at the last entry. He turns the handle. He doesn't make it. The doorknob under my hand went ice cold, and then something pressed from the other side, not pulling, not pushing, just holding it still, as if it wanted me trapped long enough for the story to finish. I yanked harder at the door, shoulder braced against the frame. The knob refused to turn. The wood shuddered under a weight pressing back from the other side. The log scratched louder behind me. I didn't need to look to know it was writing again, faster now, as if it was hurrying to catch up with me. Panic burned hot in my chest. I spun and grabbed the book, flinging it against the wall. Pages tore loose, scattering across the dusty floor. The sound that followed wasn't paper hitting wood. It was a second slam, deeper, like another desk had echoed the motion in a place I couldn't see. That broke something in me. I threw my pack on, lowered my shoulder, and rammed the door. The frame splintered, wood cracking wide enough for me to spill out into the night. Rain lashed my face. Cold air filled my lungs like I hadn't breathed in hours. I ran, boots sliding in mud, not caring where the trail went. Behind me, through the cabin window, I saw it. The guest log lying open on the desk, faint light glowing from within its pages, and in the voice of my own cadence, soft but clear, the night whispered my name. I didn't stop running until dawn broke across the ridgeline. My legs buckled on the trailhead gravel, lungs tearing with each breath. Somehow I made it back to my car, hands trembling so badly I could barely fit the key in the ignition. I told myself it had been exhaustion, imagination, maybe even a fever from the cold rain. I almost believed it until I unpacked my gear at home. At the bottom of my bag, tucked between my sleeping bag and stove, lay a single torn sheet of paper. It was the page from the log. My name written neatly at the top. The same date,
The same clean, deliberate hand, except this time there was one more line beneath it, one I hadn't seen in the cabin. He thinks it's over. And sometimes, when I wake in the dead hours of night, I hear it again, the faint scratch of a pen moving across paper in the dark, steady and patient, as if my story is still being written.